of migration. Welcome, everyone, to our May Day Trade Justice webinar. I just wanted to talk a little bit before we introduce our first speaker. NAFTA has been a major contributor to poverty, hunger, and despair at the heart of migrations from Mexico. And this is, of course, despite Trump's claims that Mexicans are benefiting greatly from the corporate trade deal. This May Day is especially meaningful given the daily threats from the ramped-up immigration raids and threats of the Trump administration. And, I think you all agree with me when I say no group of people should ever choose to leave their homeland and families. They would never choose to leave their homes and families and risk threats of death, discrimination, and imprisonment if it weren't for the interest of survival from corporate policies and the trade deal of the 1%. That's NAFTA. Now, in our show of solidarity with workers of the world and in continuing resistance to a system that creates conditions that necessitate survival migrations, we would like to welcome to tonight's webinar, first, Laura Carlsen, Program Director of the Americas Program. She's with the Center for International Policy. Celeste Drake, who is the Trade and Globalization Specialist with AFL-CIO, and Kathryn Johnson, who is Policy Impact Coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee, and that's with the Office of Public Policy and I just wanted to run through just a couple of technical things here. We use only the phone for audio, so I don't need to go over this because it's right there on the screen. I just wanted to say that the meeting room is courtesy of People Demanding Action, and the executive director is Andrea Miller, so we want to thank her for that. You can visit our website to get all of these, all of the webinars and all kinds of other information at tradejustice.net, and our Facebook also at Trade Justice Alliance. So now I'm going to give Laura's bio here, and then I will have her open her mic up for her presentation. Laura Carlsen is the Director of the Americas Program with the Center for International Policy. She holds a master's degree in Latin American Studies from Stanford University, and she is a frequent media commentator and TV host. Laura Carlsen is widely published with articles and chapters on social, economic, and political aspects of Mexico, and she has worked as a gender and communications consultant with Just Associates. She's worked with the Nobel Women's Initiative, Global Fund for Women, and as a policy consultant and writer for International Organization for Migrations. Laura Carlsen is a columnist for Foreign Policy in Focus, Huffington Post, Palabras al Margen, and a regular commentator on CCTV and KPFK Sojourner Truth. She currently hosts Hecho en America on Rompimiento TV, and that is based in Mexico City. Laura has extensively researched and organized around NAFTA since its inception, and she speaks frequently on the drug war, immigration, economic integration, and gender justice. Welcome, Laura. Your line is open. Just press *6 and you should.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you got it here. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. It's really a great opportunity to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation and for putting this together. I think it's very clear the importance of this particular issue at this time. On the one hand, we have NAFTA renegotiation. Every couple days or so, there's another statement regarding how Mexico won and how Trump is alternatively either going to renegotiate to put the United States on top again, America as he calls it, although that is, of course, an entire hemisphere, or to renegotiate it or to tear it up entirely. And then there's also the crisis and the daily news regarding the immigrant crackdown and what he portrays as an invasion of immigrants that are destroying the American way of life and posing a serious national security challenge. What is never said in this, most of which is completely and totally devoid of any real analysis of the facts in the situation, is how those two things are linked. So looking at NAFTA and the roots of migration now is absolutely essential to trying to get the nation back on the path of reality, to tell you the truth, in terms of the relationship with Mexico, and then, of course, the critical relationship with Mexicans within the United States. You can go see on the first slide, probably go over this fairly quickly because it's something I'm sure most people already know. It's an analysis that we've been developing amongst all of us for now 20 years, and it says now. And that begins with the fact that, we remember very clearly here in Mexico, and many of you might too, the beginnings of the negotiations. There was an attempt to get together between the three nations with the farm sectors and the worker sectors, but we had very little information about what was happening, and we really did not know what a free trade agreement was, and we certainly didn't know what it meant to a developing country like Mexico to enter into a free trade agreement with a country like the United States, which of course was the most powerful economic nation in the world. The lack of transparency made it impossible, and the lack of involvement made it impossible to have an impact. We didn't know that the agreement was being written by and for corporations. It was designed by them. And then in the case of Mexico, it was fairly clearly not really a trade agreement. By that time, Mexico had entered into GATT in 1986. There had been a number of national reforms carried out by the neoliberal president, Carlsen, and so it had really begun this restructuring to become a neoliberal economy, and the tariffs were pretty low at that time. There wasn't a lot that happened with NAFTA in terms of tariffs and trade in that sense. What it was more than that was an investment treaty. So what I was saying is that there was that Mexico was opened up to transnational investment really through this agreement, and that's what's made the most profound changes within the country, much more so than the vaulted free trade aspects of it, which, of course, as we know, free is really a misnomer for what happens with trade when the markets are opened up to the international market with a whole series of hidden, oftentimes, subsidies to giant corporations that enable them to monopolize and take over the smaller productive plant, especially in a country like Mexico. So the government was obliged to continue, because this had been going on, to abandon domestic industry supports and agricultural supports, consumer supports, in many ways. Anything that was considered to be an illegal subsidy under NAFTA was almost immediately gotten rid of, and this left domestic production sectors from coffee to shoes in a crisis, with almost no transitional means of confronting that crisis. It was sink or swim, but most of them had never been taught to swim, and they sank. The social sector, which comprised a huge part of particularly agriculture in Mexico, that is to say the ejidos, which are socially owned and really cover a vast percentage of Mexican land, were semi-privatized in 1992 as NAFTA was being negotiated. There's no accounting for asymmetries. And what we mean by that is many of you are familiar with the process of economic integration in the European Union. Countries in Greece were actually given measures and given compensation funds in order to get up to speed to the more developed countries. But here in the case of the United States and Mexican economies, where there was a much greater disparity between the gross national product and on almost every level, there were no accounting for those asymmetries, which meant that instead of leveling the playing field, what they actually ended up doing was locking in an extremely uneven form of relationship between the two nations in trade and investment. And then finally, contrary to Trump, this is really a U.S.-centered agreement. As I said, there was no compensation to Mexico, and it was opened up in terms of its resources, its land, and especially its labor force to become easy prey for transnational corporations that immediately almost swarmed in. And another case of example of lack of transitions was only corn was granted a 15-year period because it was so vital to rural employment, especially, as well as subsistence, and yet neither the Mexican government or the U.S. government even respected that transition period that was given for corn. And as many people know, there's approximately 2 million small corn producers that were eventually displaced from the countryside, becoming many of them migrants to the United States. On the second slide, we have this question of who won and who lost. And I think it's important here to mention the importance of the deeper level of analysis that says, why do we always have to break everything down into who won and who lost? This has a lot to do with very deeply patriarchal ways of thinking, where someone always has to win or lose. Someone is always, or one side is always dominant or submissive. And this is very characteristic of Donald Trump. And so when he says that Mexico won in NAFTA and the United States lost, he's not only applying a false reading of the facts, but he's applying a false framework for evaluating what economic integration is all about. First of all, he's basing the entire statement on the test of how much of a deficit there is in trade. In the case of Mexico, it's approximately $63 billion, although that breaks down in many different ways. For example, there's a surplus for the United States in agriculture, and that's one of the reasons we now hear talk of if Mexico comes to the point of being pushed to retaliate for trade measures against it by the United States, one of the leverage that it has is blocking U.S. agricultural imports because they're so important in the United States agricultural sector. The other is that when Mexico talks about that NAFTA was a success for Mexico, it's often cited foreign direct investment, and that includes the outsourcing that Trump used in the campaign as a way of getting workers on board, especially in many of the Rust Belt states. Well, the foreign investment that's come in can be broken down into really two major categories, and one is just outright privatization and sale of Mexican productive plant to U.S.-based transnational corporations. So that means, for example, small and medium-sized and even home-sized chicken producers are taken over by Tyson and Pilgrim's Pride that are now gigantic. The small shops that you would find on every corner are driven out of business by Walmart that completely invades the retail sector. And this goes on and on. Shoe producers, kind of more artisan level producers, and even medium-sized industries within the country that were decimated by the imports from the United States that were producing with greater capital injections and more technology, generally speaking, as well as certain types of subsidies and benefits from their own much wealthier government. What this did is it benefited the elites in both countries, and this is why we see that the Mexican ruling class defends NAFTA and is now dependent on NAFTA because they have investments in these same transnational corporations that in many cases ate up some of the more successful businesses within Mexico, or that they eventually invested in at the expense of really selling off a huge part of Mexico's own national resources that were the patrimony to future generations for many, many years. The third is to talk about the broken promises that were part of NAFTA from the point of view of Mexico. First one, and this is probably the most egregious lie that either somebody grossly miscalculated, and if you look at some of the economic modeling that came out about how great NAFTA was going to be, you can see that it was almost all way off. Or there was actually knowledge that was going to occur. It was part of kind of the NAFTA pulling the wool over the eyes of the people who would be paying the price of it in years to come, because the hourly nominal wage of manufacturing in Mexico is still under $2, and it's actually fallen in recent years. It's fallen a lot lately because of the fall of the price of the peso, the value of the peso since Donald Trump was elected. In the United States, it's I lost my number here. Let me see if I've got it here. Well, it's about $20. Yeah, it's about $20. It's about $20, and that's actually been on the rise since NAFTA occurred. So you have a divergence in the wage rates, and that's of course the key to understanding why corporations are outsourcing, and yet there isn't a single proposal coming out of the Trump administration, as if he really cared about this, that would address the fact of this wage divergence by requiring corporations to pay a decent wage to their workers in Mexico or in other countries where they're producing. The general increase in wage disparity in Mexico has to do with the fact that there was also polarization that happened there in terms of the North being far more successful in some sectors under NAFTA, and the South falling more in the small, often indigenous and much poorer states within the country. This has become a gigantic problem because that's where we see the biggest growth of poverty, which has indeed, in absolute terms, grown since NAFTA went into effect. It's over half the population and over 50 million people. In addition to that, there's been an increase in the rate of food poverty, which is to say hunger, and a number of human social indices that have to do with well-being within the country. There was also a myth that there would be a convergence of the gross domestic product in the case of Mexico, gross national product in the case of the United States, slightly different methodology, I think. And in Mexico, it grew at the rate of about 3.4% at first, and then 2.1%. The case is that when you factor this all out over the NAFTA years, and then you add, and then you divide it by per capita because of the population growth, you have almost flatline growth, that is to say non-growth, in Mexico during the NAFTA years. And this goes to one of the biggest and most false promises of NAFTA, which is that it would help Mexico to develop. That in a world that was globalizing, having an outward-looking economy, with the focus being on exports and foreign revenues, Mexico would develop and would be able to have an overall more stronger and more beneficial economy for all. That's again assuming the now completely debunked trickle-down theory, in a sense, which was another one of the promises that were not borne out. With the U.S. is roughly between 4 and 6% in terms of gross national product growth, with the exceptions, of course, of the 2008 and 2009 crises. So you see that the divergence there has been very strong as well, and even starting, of course, from the basis of a much, much larger economy in the United States than in Mexico. The other broken promise that we'll talk a little about more in depth in the next section is the reduction of migration. At the peak year, it was up to 500,000 people a year that were displaced from the countryside, displaced from small industries, and forced to migrate to the United States after internal migration didn't work either, and then become part of this criminalized culture against immigration within the United States that's now flaring up again. There's some statistics there about what happened in the rural sector and the way it was depleted, and that says a lot as well about the immigration. I want to just take a look at this pay stub, because just a couple of days ago, as many of you know, we are on the Caravan Against Fear here and have been traveling along the border to look at what's happening with the immigration situation, talk a little about that later. But along the road, I happened to meet up with the Comité Fronterizo de Obreras, which is right on the border in the state of Coahuila, Piedras Negras, and there was a woman there who works in the maquiladora, and that's the offshore assembly plants that were established along the border, and that are part of kind of this idea that of corporations taking advantage of cheap labor in Mexico, that has been a big part of NAFTA itself. So she showed me her pay stub, and to make a long story short, we've got this woman, and this one is working 49, 56, almost 70 hours a week. She works every week. It sometimes varies, but she works every week from at least 50 hours and 7 days a week. I don't know how anyone could really actually do that. And she actually had a take-home pay of about, I'm missing the figure, you've got 1,500 pesos, which is $150, of about $150. No, it's $86.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So she, nobody can live on that. It's not like the cost of living is that people breathe on air in Mexico. I say the cost of living is cheaper, but it's not even that much. So this is a kind of a race to the bottom that you're seeing. And what these companies did this lately was, of course, take advantage of the weakened peso without providing any raises. She's being deducted for a cup of coffee in the morning. I mean, we're looking at an almost feudal system within the maquiladora system, and this is a characteristic trait of NAFTA. So to sum this up on the next slide, I believe it is, what we have is a neoliberal free trade model that is displacing people, forcing them out, not just to necessarily to search for a better life, although everyone has a right to do that, of course, but also for even just survival, to be able to have the basics of living. So that leads to forced migration. As was mentioned at the beginning, most people will not choose to leave their homes, to leave their families, and go to a new place if they have that kind of a choice. In Mexico now with the returns, even though the situation here hasn't improved much, you see that many people are really have a strong tie to Mexico and are willing to come back even when the economic promises are not great. That leads to the criminalization after the forced migration. These people who have been victims of the public policy of NAFTA from their two governments, and with the United States in practically imposing it, are then criminalized, and the border is militarized. And as militarization increases within not just the border area, but within all of Mexico, and immigrants are lumped into so-called terrorist and drug cartel threats, then we've got a system where we've created an infrastructure for the armed defense of that same neoliberal free trade model. On the next slide should be, I think, let's see. Did you have that map of the caravan?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, could we call that up for a second?
Sure.
Okay, so the caravan began in Sacramento and went through all of California first, because as many of you know, in this times of crackdown and racism and xenophobia, California has been a leading state, and they've got a state sanctuary law that's coming up. And the unions, the SEIU that helped organize this caravan along with other organizations, wanted to support that process. And then we went along the border to communities. You can see the crazy route we've been on for the last 23 days, I think it's been. And what we found in that time is a lot of fear. It's a caravan against fear, and there is fear. There's since the Trump administration is now at least threatening with deportation and using some classic cases to show that he's willing to carry out those threats of individuals who were relatively safe before, including people who have DACA protections under the Obama program, including women and children, including law-abiding citizens that have no criminal record whatsoever. This is creating a chilling effect within the communities where there are literally people who are afraid to drive. because just being picked, not having a license can be considered a crime that's deportable, and actually just existing in their communities is becoming a deportable crime these days. However, they're resisting, and they're organizing to know their rights and to use them within this. One of the questions we came up with, what's happening in these trends, because the government announced, John Kelly announced, that there's been a 40% drop in apprehensions at the border. So where are the migrants? But at the same time, what we noticed, there's an increase in women and children that are being apprehended at the border. There's an increase in deportations, obviously. There's an increase in there's a 32% increase in deportations, and the number of non-criminal immigrants that have been arrested has doubled, which feeds into that deterrence and attrition strategy that's going on right now. The deportations so far, it's a 32% increase in arrests. These people are under ordered of deportations, but they haven't been deported yet. The deportations have only gone up slightly because this infrastructure is just kicking in. But here on the border, people are quite clear that this is going to happen, that he's fully serious about this in this vision of white male nativist America in the relatively near future. There are reports of slower flows coming up from Mexico, which would indicate that fewer people are leaving their homes. So, as many people know, the net migration from Mexico is now negative. But the Central Americans, regardless of what happens, continue to leave because their situations are so dire between the violence of poverty and the violence of drug cartels and the state in their countries of origin. I'm going to skip to finish up to the renegotiation and why this is related. There are several points that came out of a binational forum with union leaders and academics held in Mexico City. The first point of the renegotiation is the necessity to include a labor chapter within it. You can see there that this has to include minimum wages that would tend toward a convergence of wages within the region. The second is to include the core conventions of the International Labor Organization, the increase in the minimum wage, include immigration reform. This is just vital because we're talking about labor flows, essentially, when we talk about immigration. We're not talking about invasions of foreign people to try to take over the United States. The fifth is to guarantee the security and physical integrity of migrant workers and their families. The sixth, prioritize human and labor rights and security policies, which is subject for another day, but very, very important. And to create effective trade adjustment and compensation, what was not done in the original negotiation of NAFTA, including expanding the North American Development Bank. Goals of financial inclusion, to be able to apply remittances in more productive ways, transparency, and then the vitally important one of including a gender perspective, because all these policies need to take into account women's specific needs, contributions, and leadership capacities. When we think of all this, really the most important thing then to finish up is that NAFTA renegotiation is urgently needed because Mexico and Mexican people, the vast majority, have actually suffered under NAFTA. If it comes to a renegotiation that is not favorable, there are many sectors that are ready and willing and actually have been calling for a long time to scrap NAFTA. But in that case, it's important to take into account that it's not the same to call for that now 20 years later as it was at the beginning when we began this process, because of the way that industries have been oriented toward NAFTA in the meantime. There would need to be international support and national policies to take care of those transitions to avoid human suffering from the adjustments that would need to take place. And the second point is that immigration reform is fundamental to this process to accommodate labor flows which are natural in these processes of economic integration with full human and civil rights. They also need to put the labor chapter, and the environmental chapter as well into the agreement. There's a campaign going on right now called Raise Wages, Not Walls, that is calling for minimum wage increase in the United States and Mexico. We expect the Canadians to come on, and that could be the beginning of a people's position for the renegotiation of NAFTA and rethinking the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. That was tons of information. I'm glad we have a recording of it. And what we're going to do now, we have time for a few questions. I was going to go ahead unless you had a question for Laura in the meantime while people are typing in their questions. Did you have a question?
Well, there are a few
Adam?
technical questions that came up in the chat box, and I just wanted to answer those for quickly for anyone who might be listening to those. One is about the links. If you leave the http:// off the link, your link should work fine. As Carrie said in the chat box, slides are in the Facebook group. However, they're not on our website, separate from the webinar, but the video of the webinar is. We can look into adding the slides to the website as well. So far, the only question is, and I'm not sure if this is for Laura, but the question is, are you interested in the Constitution as it relates to foreign trade? So
I'm not really aware of the constitutional law. I've been working in this for a long time, and aside from some of the changes that took place in Mexico at the beginning, in the United States, I do not recall an instance where trade and negotiations required any constitutional reforms. Most of this takes place at the level of legislation and agreements between the nations.
I have a question that could maybe use a little clarification. I was wondering if you could maybe discuss a little bit about the difference between the enforceable articles that are put into the actual trade agreement and what are called side agreements, and how these trade agreements have been sold to people in all three countries based on maybe the side agreements.
Well, that's a good question, because when we say that we want the labor chapter included in the text of the trade agreement, of any trade agreement or the environmental chapter, that doesn't mean just taking the agreements that exist on the side now and sticking them in the body of the text. That was more or less done in the Peru agreement, and it still does not guarantee that there are really workable sanctions for violation of labor law and environmental law. So those would have to be rewritten, and they would have to be rewritten in such a way that the sanctions, most important thing is that there are agile processes for any complaints that are filed, because there have been many complaints filed and almost none of them have received justice under the process is the way it is. And that not only that, but that having them there creates a disincentive for transnational corporations working between those countries to actually violate the local national labor laws and the environmental laws. It also means that many of those national labor laws, in the case of Mexico, would need to be brought up to a minimal standard before you could re-enter, before you could have a fair trade agreement.
Thank you. Adam, is there another question in the chat box?
Yeah, I actually had a question, but let me check. Okay, here's one from Stan Sorcher. The U.S. government doesn't enforce violations in general and labor violations in particular. Does it really help to have stronger language if our government always defers to investor interests?
I think that that's important, because what we're really going for in this labor agreement is to guarantee the right to collective bargaining and work organization. It's because really the questioner is correct in the sense that unless we even out the power relationship that exists right now between labor and business, we really won't, any kind of language will really be pretty much window dressing. It's certainly true in Mexico. In Mexico, actually, there's progressive labor law. It's far more progressive than in the United States, and yet the practices are abysmal. So what really needs to be done is that there has to be no incentive. Right now, the incentive, as was shown in that race to the bottom and in the pay stub, the incentive is to provide the cheapest, most exploited labor possible so that companies will bring in that foreign investment. Unless there's incentive to respect the law by the fact that laborers themselves are organized and able to do that, it's true that we will not be able to make a lot of progress. But that's why so much of this, the ideal labor chapter, has to address that issue.
Thank you. Adam, did you have your own question, Adam?
I did, actually, which is I was wondering if, but Paul Plansburg just posted one, so let's do his first. NAFTA has created winners and losers. How do we present it so Americans can relate to their Mexican counterparts?
How do we present this to Americans to what? To relate to their Mexican counterparts?
Yes. How do we present NAFTA so that Americans can relate to their, people in the U.S. can relate to the experience people in Mexico?
You know, it's a little tricky right now because of all this Mexico bashing that was related to NAFTA during the campaign and during the elections, and now after the elections as well. But essentially, you know, the argument is the same that we've been using since the negotiations, of saying there is the breakdown of who won and who lost over NAFTA does not start at the Rio Grande River and the border with Canada. It's a breakdown between workers and companies and corporations. So it's not a national issue. It's an issue where Mexican workers are suffering even more than U.S. workers, and that if those alliances were built, they would be able to go back to the companies and demand better conditions, and thereby begin to have the ability to create a different situation for workers across the board. I think we need to think of a lot of other arguments as well in the current context, and that's probably a collective task for so many of you who are working on these issues in your communities and in your organizations across the country, as well as us here. There's a huge task on building those binational, not just links between people, but in building those binational messages as well.
Yes. Thank you. Adam, go ahead and ask your question because it is getting on, and Celeste is waiting in the wings. Go ahead.
Got it. Okay, so my question was, I was wondering if Laura could tell us a little bit more about the caravan.
Yeah, so the caravan is right now almost getting close to Los Angeles. And one of the most important things is what's going to happen tomorrow. We've gone on this trip in order to see what was happening with the way that people are feeling this crackdown, but also with the way that they're resisting. And it's been very interesting to see, since it's organized by unions, in large part, it's been very interesting to see the way that the immigration and the labor issues are coming together. As many know, May 1st, which is International Workers' Day, and a traditional time of mobilization of labor across the world, around the world, is also going to be this year a day of mobilization for immigrant communities. And whereas there was a time when labor unions considered immigrants to be to undermine the labor movement and workers' rights in general, that has really fallen away to a realization that the defense of those low-wage workers who have been denied their labor rights is fundamental to labor struggle to increase labor rights in all senses. So coming out on May 1st, with the caravan, we'll be together. We'll be at the Los Angeles demonstration, which is likely to be one of the biggest. We've seen throughout everywhere we went almost that local groups are planning to mobilize as well. So I sure hope that everybody on the call is planning to go out tomorrow. A day without immigrants, a strike in some communities, a day of activities in others. The call is no more business as usual. Going to work, going to school, purchasing at all, basically, in order to send a strong message that we are united and that we're fighting back.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. This is an issue that really strikes at the heart of the trade justice movement, and we really appreciate your taking your time from the caravan to join us. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce Celeste Drake. Celeste is a Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at AFL-CIO. She works to improve U.S. trade policy so it does not send more jobs overseas, and to improve labor rights for workers overseas so that workers globally can race to the top instead of having global corporations push us to the bottom. Celeste earned a BA and a JD and an MPP from UCLA. Lots of acronyms there. And Celeste, I hope your line is open.
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Fantastic.
Great.
Okay. So a lot of this is going to be repetitive of what you just, so I won't really go into any detail, and I'll get quickly to the end of the program where we talk about what's happening in D.C. right now. So here I'm just mentioning 3 ways workers who were both in the U.S. and in Mexico and, frankly, and in Canada were failed by the rules of NAFTA. So whether it was displacing people from the jobs they've had, or whether it was the false promise, as Laura described about the labor provisions, or whether it was simply empowering corporate and investor interests. So in other words, making working people and their organizations weaker while making the employers and the top 1% stronger. So those are 3 basic failures. And we end up paying for those in our wages and working conditions and standards of living. So next. And this is just a chart to show you the immigration trends from not only from Mexico, but also the northern triangle of Central America, because that also gets at CAFTA. So both of these trade agreements were pitched to Americans as they are going to be so great for the countries that we trade with that you won't have any more forced economic migration. Folks will be able to care for their families in their home countries, and it's going to solve the problems. And NAFTA went into effect in 1994, and you can see very clearly there was no downward impact on migration. CAFTA, interestingly, went into effect in 2007, and you can see really gradual increases after that time. And the reasons that you don't see the spike that you see after NAFTA is, one, because of the scale. These countries are so much smaller. But 2, if you remember what happened right when CAFTA went into effect, it was the crash. And so it became very clear that, a lot of the jobs that used to exist in the United States and opportunities that were there weren't there because of our crash, and we were shedding jobs by the hundreds of thousands per month. So this is just a point to say, to go back again, another lie that we were told, and in fact the impact wasn't so great in the countries that we were trading with. Next slide, please. And this is some information. I know we've had Manuel Perez-Rosa on the call before, and he put this together, and it just kind of says exactly what you just heard, so we will skip this slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about the sham unions in Mexico, because this is a little bit of a detail Laura didn't talk so much about. But what happens in Mexico, and this is historic and going back to, a century, they have something that's called protection contracts. And I don't like to use that term because it doesn't, what it sounds like it is, doesn't really describe what it really is. So I call it sham unions because that makes more sense immediately. So they call the protection contracts the agreement between an employer and a sham union that's designed to prevent real unions. And a lot of times these contracts are signed when the investor announces the investment. So they haven't even broken ground on building the factory or building the workplace. and the sham union comes in and says, sign with us, and we'll make sure that you don't have to deal with any real unions asking you for better working conditions, better wages, better pay and benefits, all of these things. And the workers then come a couple years later to work in the shiny new plant, and they think there might be a good opportunity for higher wages because it's clearly built by, you know, a very wealthy global corporation. And to the extent that they ask, they're told, oh, you have no chance to negotiate an agreement because there's already an agreement. And they look around and they say, there's no union here servicing me. Can I get a copy of what the contract is? Can I get a copy of the bylaws of this alleged union so that I can figure out how I can take down the leaders and get good people in as leaders and negotiate our own contract? And unfortunately, that's never been able to happen because Mexican law until now has not required workers a chance to see the contracts that they're covered by or to see the bylaws of the unions that they are supposedly a member of. Next slide, please. So NAFTA, how does NAFTA actually promote these sham unions? Well, it's doing it for more than 2 decades because many of these sham unions are actually aligned with local, regional, and national political parties. And folks, you know, think about how this is. If you've got an entrenched kind of, you know, kind of like the old boss tweed that we all learned about from New York City in our history class, it's like that. There's a little political power center, and a multinational firm comes in and talks to the political power center and says, what do we get from you if we locate here? And so not only is it the tax holidays and the yes, we'll look the other way on environmental and labor inspections, but it's also, yes, we're happy to set you up with a sham union. And if that sham union is allied to the local government, and that's why the multinational decided to locate there, you can bet that the multinational, no matter how it tries to face publicly and say, oh, we respect workers, you can bet they don't. And they're never going to complain about, oh my gosh, Mexican labor law is abusive, because that's exactly why they agreed to locate there. So really, when you look at this number, an estimated 90% of, you know, supposed union contracts in Mexico are these sham contracts with sham unions. You can see just one of the many reasons why wages not only haven't risen under NAFTA, but they're actually worse now compared to the United States than they were pre-NAFTA. And they are in key export industries, including export auto and export agriculture. Next. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background I wanted to give there on NAFTA and workers and all that. Now I want to turn to, with that background and with the great background that Laura gave you, the election and kind of what we're dealing with in D.C., right? And no matter what, you know, side of the bipartisan divide that you might be on or on neither side in the U.S., we have what this map looks like. And we know that Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote, and we also know that's not how you get elected to president in the United States under our system. But look carefully at some of the states that went for Trump on this map that typically go to Democrats. They include Michigan and Wisconsin, right? They both went for Trump. Pennsylvania and Ohio are always in play. They often go to Democrats. They did not this year. Occasionally, Indiana and Iowa are in play. They certainly really weren't this year. So really the only thing in sort of the old industrial Northwest that went blue are Minnesota and Illinois. There's a real linking between the states that went red this time and went for Trump and the states that have been most impacted by trade-related job losses, and not just to Mexico, but also to China and to some other countries. But that's a real link there, and it was clear in what we at the AFL-CIO were hearing from our members during election time. I mean, it was also an interest in trade that we all on this call got stirred up due to our activity around Fast Track and around the TPP. And very clearly, Mr. Trump spoke to trade in a way that resonated with the very workers who have lived through wave after wave of plant closing. And unfortunately, Hillary Clinton did not speak as effectively to those particular workers. Now, all kinds of other things played in the election, of course, and we know this. Racism played a role in the election, and sexism played a role in the election, and all of this. But it's important to notice that you can't say it was only these things. It was also this issue of trade and job losses to trade, and a candidate who appeared to speak effectively about it. Next slide, please. So what did he promise for these folks? He said, oh, NAFTA's terrible, it's horrible. And then he went on, and I think, again, Laura gave a great talk about when he's saying, oh, it's, the Mexicans are stealing our jobs, and we just negotiated NAFTA improperly, Mexico's doing the best of us. We all know, anybody who's been on this call before, there are winners and losers from trade, but it's not nations. It's really the 1% versus the 99%. And the big winners in NAFTA were the corporations, the economic elites, and the losers were the workers in every single country. Workers are worse off now, and the last time I gave a presentation on this call, I had all the charts showing union density is down, wage stagnation has increased. This is true across all 3 NAFTA countries. So he tells folks, NAFTA's terrible, I'm going to fix it for you. Well, how's he going to do this? Just recently, he's gone back and forth. Last week, he was going to immediately pull out. He wasn't going to immediately pull out. So we're at the place now where he's saying, I maintain my right to pull out of NAFTA, but I think I'll try to renegotiate it instead. So how's that process going to play out? We expect official notice of the NAFTA renegotiations to be sent to Congress within 2 weeks or so. They are about to confirm in the Senate Robert Lighthizer, who will be the new United States Trade Representative. He's been held up for a number of reasons, including the fact that he needed a waiver to get a vote because he was a registered lobbyist who lobbied for a foreign interest. So in order to approve somebody for a cabinet position, the Senate has a process where you need a waiver. And the Democrats in the Senate have been holding that up because Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has been holding up this deal that has to do with retirement, health and pension funds for mine workers who are affected by asbestosis and black lung and all of the things that go along with that. So they said, look, we can agree to Lighthizer, but only when you agree to do what you've done. So this has all been delaying, and it looks like it's going to be finished up within the next week. So when that notice comes, it will say to Congress, I want to start negotiating NAFTA within 90 days. And at that point, supposedly, there will be discussion between Congress and Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross and the other folks in the administration working on Congress. And then usually, with that notice comes an announcement that there will be a public hearing on the NAFTA renegotiation. So folks like us will have an opportunity to submit comments or to actually appear at the hearing. And usually they give you 30 days to write your comments, and then they have the hearing a couple of weeks after that. So we can expect the hearing maybe to be sometime in early to mid-June. Okay, next slide, please. So we know a little bit about where we think the administration is going to go on this because there were some leaked negotiating objectives for NAFTA. And you can see here, they duplicate the TPP talking points in many ways. They were quite vague. They certainly did not include any kind of ISDS elimination or procurement obligations elimination. And they did make reference to the financial service industry and pharmaceutical industries. So it gave you the sense that sort of the Wall Street wing of the Trump administration was busy writing those objectives and not really doing anything to address what has been the real problems with NAFTA that drive wages down, which are labor rights, investor rights, all of these things. Next slide, please. So if NAFTA goes in that direction, that it ends up very similar to a TPP, strangely, ironically, that may help us stop NAFTA from getting worse, because in part, in addition to our good work from the progressive side making the TPP toxic, another thing that aided us in that fight were people that had the exact opposite interests than we do. They were Republicans in Congress who were so beholden to their lobbyist friends who are the pharmaceutical companies, who are the financial services companies, that they were literally holding up and saying to President Obama, you have to make this worse for working people to get my approval. And those people are still around, and they may play the same role. So that's one thing that could help us if we end up having to fight a worse NAFTA, which wouldn't that be ironic? In the meantime, we all need to push the Democrats more towards the progressive, New Deal, Bernie type, however you want to call it, economic agenda, because we know that the neoliberal economic agenda that many, though not all and not even most, but many Democrats have been pushing for the last 20, 25 years, isn't playing right now. People aren't buying it. They've heard enough about let's be business friendly and let's do all these tax breaks and da-da-da-da. And people, are not believing it. So we need to work on, again, those new Dems that we typically don't see as having our view on trade and work on them. In the meantime, whoever can work with the so-called populist Republicans, they need to get them to speak up against the Wall Streeters who are controlling the negotiations. So every time that a Gary Cohn or a Stephen Mnuchin, speaks up and says something about we've got to help our friends on Wall Street and we've got to change NAFTA and make it cover e-commerce and make it cover biologic drugs and all of these things, there have to be Republicans on the other side saying, wait a minute, that's exactly why the TPP didn't work. This is what we don't want to do. It would be great to get more members of Congress to co-sponsor Mr. DeFazio's resolution. It's non-binding, but it's a good marker out there for what a good NAFTA renegotiation should be. And as I always say, it's important for all of us to stay active and don't just post and repost things on your Twitter account and on your Facebook. It's good to do that, certainly, but face-to-face discussions are far more convincing, and you're much more likely to open a mind or change a mind if you're speaking with somebody face-to-face than if you're just having a Twitter war with them or trying to outpost on Facebook. And then, of course, when you do tweet, use the hashtags BetterTrade and replace NAFTA and talk about issues that are important to you and try and get some publicity, right, and some ability for people to see this and bring it out into a transparency so that it's more popular. Okay, so what are we seeking? And I think Laura again went through a lot of this. I'm writing our comments for the AFL-CIO so we can have those out in public as soon as they've called for comments. But the alternative trade model has to enshrine progressive values and human rights. It can't just be about making business easier to do. It has to be about standards of living and consumer environmental protections. So in other words, we're not interested in just taking NAFTA and deleting a sentence or adding a sentence or changing a word or putting in a few commas. It's really about saying we have to start over. And some of these things need to be absolutely gone and need to add a bunch of new stuff. So in our labor chapter, which Dan asked a great question about, we have included this idea of transnational bargaining. so that Mexican workers can join with American workers and Canadian workers whose unions are more likely to have resources than their union. And say to companies, if you're operating in two places, you have to negotiate with workers in both places. You can't be Ford and have to deal with the United Auto Workers here and then deal with nobody or a protection union in Mexico. Then to get this question of the government doesn't actually enforce. Well, we are writing into our model the right for interested parties to go to domestic courts to seek enforcement. They can say, well, first of all, we put it in the hands of an independent secretariat so that the work of the secretariat can't be blocked or slowed down in any way by a disinterested government. And then if the independent secretariat doesn't act, we can actually go to court and a judge can order issuing for saying for the secretariat, you must act. And then if the secretariat acts and we get a, description that a country is in violation and it refuses to approve after given an opportunity, and then they say, well, the ultimate sanction in a trade agreement is usually one side imposes tariffs on the other. In other words, we're going to make it more expensive to sell your goods here, and that's the punishment. And the idea there is then that the actual employers themselves have an interest in following the laws because otherwise their sales are going to go down. So we're saying, again, if a country, let's say the Secretariat has determined that the United States is out of compliance with the labor obligation in some way, and Mexico is not putting a tariff on goods from the U.S. because, it doesn't want to turn around and be challenged on its labor practices. Again, interested parties could go to domestic courts and say, the sanctions are not being imposed. I want you to grant me individual remedies, and domestic courts could do that. And the way that we think this is so much better than ISDS is we're not taking away power from our domestic governments as ISDS does. And we're including in there a right to a living wage, which is really, really important. And I think then my next slide is just for questions.
That's right. That was great, Celeste.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if anyone has a question for Celeste, please put it into the chat box, and Adam will field the questions. Adam, did you have a question for Celeste in the meantime?
Well, there's a couple questions in the chat box that I can kind of respond to.
Okay.
Absolutely. The Constitution says that Congress is responsible for foreign trade. The problem is, and this was the fight that we had 2 years ago over the fast-track bill, and that's that with the fast-track procedure, Congress essentially delay a lot of its power, it cedes power to the administration. And on the one hand, you have to cede some negotiating power to an administration, no matter what the topic is, whether it's trade or anything else in foreign policy. Because, think about it, your only other option is putting all of Congress on airplanes and flying them to the negotiating stage, and it just wouldn't, you can't do that. So yes, you have to have, the administration stand in. But there's a lot of overreach that Congress gives up with the fast-track process. It doesn't have to, and it just chooses to. So essentially, it's given the fast-track power, that's it. Congress is really done. All that the administration has to do under fast-track is keep the members of relevant committees, but essentially nobody else in Congress, well informed about what's going on. And then Congress gets an up or down vote on the final product, but there's no way really for the rest of Congress to say, I would vote for this if you fixed, items A, B, C, and D. That's not part of, there is no back and forth with Congress and with the administration, and it's a problem, and that's why we oppose fast track, not because unconstitutional, but because it's a terrible, terrible idea for Congress to give away that much power. And what we've seen when Congress has done that is that we've gotten terrible, awful, bad trade agreements that really do work well for some people. And those some people are the 1% and the global corporations, and they don't work well for anybody else.
Is there another question, Adam?
Anna says, do you have more information about developed alternative models of trade that we can cite in presenting opposition?
Sure. So ours is going to be, I would say, continue to check out the AFL-CIO.org website, and we're going to be posting ours there. And, of course, I'll be tweeting about it from @CDrakeFairTrade. But our European brothers and sisters have developed the European alternative trade model. And I think if you just Google alternative trade model, you can find a progressive trade document written there. And what we're putting together for the NAFTA, we're also going to be working with our brothers and sisters in Canada, in Mexico, to see how much of this we can get adopted sort of in a tri-national way. And there's going to be a big civil society conference at the end of May, like May 25th through 27th in Mexico City, where we meet and discuss these issues and see, which things we can get going. And that's going to be a bit difficult because actually the UNT, which is the Independent Union Federation in Mexico, is split on NAFTA. It's really not of one mind. So there's a big portion of it that is viewing things in the way we're viewing it, and there's a big portion that simply wants to oppose NAFTA renegotiation because they think it's much more likely that it gets worse than better. So, there are, and that's a totally understandable position. So a lot of times these reaching consensus is not as easy as you would like it to be or as you would think it might be. So we'll see what happens.
We have a question from Chris Marshall, who asks, how could U.S. unions work with Mexican and Canadian? Can you expand?
Sure. So we already work with them pretty closely, whether it's, phone calls or emails or high-level visits. We just had the leaders of the Mexican UNT for a bilateral discussion in Washington, D.C. Our president was in Canada visiting the CLC, Canadian Labour Congress president, a month before that. So we already work together, and in terms of transnational bargaining, we don't have an example that ever happening because the corporations don't, as you can imagine. It's one of the reasons they do so well is that they keep working people isolated behind national lines, but the corporations have total freedom of movement. So we do have one example of, it's called the Bangladesh Accord, and after the terrible Rana Plaza tragedy in which a garment factory collapsed and killed over 1,000 people and injured a couple of thousand more, international trade unions from the U.S., from Europe, worker NGOs and advocacy groups, and Bangladesh's own workers and unions got together and negotiated a document which wasn't a contract that had to do with wages, but was a contract that had to do with workers' rights as regards safety. And it was signed by many international brands, mostly from Europe, but some from the U.S. and other places, and had rights in there and rights that could be enforceable through an arbitration. So if on the panel there are union members, and if the union members on the panel are saying these safety rights are being violated, they can go to an arbitrator and get a decision that's binding and would force, if the workers want, an improvement in conditions. So you just get together and you work, and how it would work, potentially with, say, with Ford is the Mexican workers' representatives, the American workers' representatives would get together, and it wouldn't be about negotiating the exact same pay, because if you forced the companies in Mexico to pay what U.S. workers are getting, it would shut them down, because that's not where their economy is. But you can certainly work together and bargain transnationally and have the threat of strike transnationally and get wages up in Mexico to where they should be. So minimum wages right now, you cannot live on $2 an hour, but you could live on $3, $4, $5 an hour. So how do you start bringing those up and regularly bargaining so that you can continue to bring them up? And that's how that would work.
Great. Do we have time for more questions?
No, not really, Adam.
Okay.
I was going to finish off with one very short question. We were talking about fast track, and I was just wondering, Celeste, you might want to tell us when the current fast track is going to expire.
So fast track lasts automatically for 3 years and then extends for another 3 years unless Congress affirmatively votes to not have the extension go into place. And so that's never happened, just like Congress has never voted down a trade agreement under fast track. So for all intents and purposes, it will go into the administration of the next president who follows Trump. And Congress believes that it applies to the renegotiation of NAFTA, which is why this 90-day notice period and all of this apply, because at one point it seemed like the administration was arguing that fast track didn't apply to NAFTA because NAFTA was an existing agreement, not a new one. And apparently folks from the administration were telling Congress, we're not going to do the 90-day notice and we can dispense with all of that. And I believe the answer was, if you try to do that, we will not advance your trade agreement, so you better play ball. And that's why so far the administration is admitting that it has to follow the rules, admittedly very weak rules of fast track.
And it needs 50 plus 1, right?
Yeah, so what happens is when a trade agreement comes up under fast track, there is no opportunity to filibuster in the Senate. So it needs a bare minimum vote. So 50% plus 1 in the House and 50% plus 1 in the Senate.
Okay. Thank you very much, Celeste. It was really great as usual, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. I would now like to introduce Kathryn Johnson, who is the Policy Impact Coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee's Office for Public Policy and Advocacy. Before joining AFSC, Kathryn was a field organizer for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, which is where we got to know her quite well. And as a field organizer, she educated and mobilized against the TPP. Previously, Kathryn served as an assistant director of the Guatemala Human Rights Commission, USA, supporting human rights defenders, educating the international community, coordinating a network of activists to demand responsible U.S. policies, highlighting the root causes of migration, and advocating for humane responses from the U.S. government. Kathryn has also organized students and activists on issues related to sweatshop labor, fair trade, environmental protections, and campesino land rights. She has a BA in International Trade and Human Development from Western Washington University and a Master's of Public Administration from the Evans School at the University of Washington. Welcome, Kathryn.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing well. I'm very excited to be back on these calls. I'm especially excited to be on here right now to talk about how trade activists can get involved in the immigration struggle, because there's so much that people can do right now. So I'm going to talk about things that people can do at 3 different levels. First of all, at the national level, and then at the state and local level, and then at the very personal, like hyper-local level. So backing up a little bit, I want to give you a little bit of a sense of where we are. As many of you probably know, the Trump administration started off the presidency right away signing a couple of executive orders that were really terrifying and really, really challenging for those who are undocumented and those of us who are working on immigration issues. One of them was focused on increasing interior enforcement and basically criminalizing everybody who's here in the country, either here without documents or here, and also many people who are here even with documents. And so really added a lot of uncertainty to who would be targeted and who sort of was at risk of deportation and detention and deportation. And then the second executive order was focused on the border and really threatened to militarize and really focus on this building a wall along the southern border, but really it was much broader than that. It also called for hiring another 5,000 Customs and Border Patrol agents along the border, increasing detention along the border, and really trying to close it off entirely, which, as many of you know, I'm sure, has the militarization of the border has caused thousands of deaths over the last several years along that area. And so what we've seen in the first month of the Trump administration hasn't yet been an increase in immigrant detention and deportation, but clear intention of increasing that. The Trump administration has since asked for money specifically to increase detention significantly, specifically to be able to detain 45,000 people on a nightly basis across the United States just for immigration violations. It's also asked for additional money to hire. He has a goal of hiring 10,000 more ICE agents, immigration and customs enforcement, and all of these things. So this is where we also have that opportunity to really make a change at this moment at the federal level. So to carry out all of these things that he's laid out in his executive orders, the militarization of the border, the stepped-up immigration enforcement, and the stepped-up enforcement, or the stepped-up detention, all of that requires a huge amount of money, billions and billions of dollars. And in fact, just for the rest of this fiscal year, which goes through September, the administration asked for an additional $3 billion. If you've been following the news fairly closely, you might have seen that the Democrats, fortunately, did push it back against the border wall specifically, but not against the rest of the funding, not against the militarization of the border, not against the increased detention, not against the increased enforcement, which rips families apart, is destroying communities, et cetera. And so they've passed what's called, last year they punted the budget fight. They didn't actually pass the budget last September and instead passed what's called a continuing resolution. And so they had a deadline of Friday that they needed to pass a new appropriations bill to fund the government. They punted again. They passed a continuing resolution. And so we actually have an opportunity this week to be able to influence the current budget year, to influence that proposed $3 billion. And so one thing that you can do right now, starting tomorrow morning, is call especially your senators, and tell them no additional funding for immigration detention, immigration enforcement, or border militarization, not just the wall. But we're going to keep seeing this fight. It's going to be between now and September when they have to pass a budget for the next fiscal year. We're definitely going to see the administration asking for billions and billions of more dollars at the same time that they're defunding all sorts of human needs, healthcare, education, environmental protection, et cetera. So, this is a real fight in Congress. There's a lot of pushback in public opinion. There's a lot of pushback, fortunately, from actually both the right and the left on this. So you really have an opportunity at the national level to make a difference. So meet with your representatives, call them, get in touch. So that's the national level. But there's actually quite a bit that people can do at the state and local level. Even though we have this image of people getting picked up across the country in raids carried out by immigration agents, how most people end up in immigration custody is actually through local or state police. They're picked up for some sort of criminal offense, or perceived criminal offense, or just racially profiled by local or state police, and then funneled into ICE custody. But fortunately, there's a lot that people can do at the local level to make sure that that doesn't happen in their communities. And that's where you've probably heard about this fight over sanctuary cities, that some states, counties, and cities have decided that they don't want their local police or other local officials helping immigration agents do their job. And so we've seen different policies in hundreds of jurisdictions across the country, actually, that range from either just generally welcoming resolutions, just saying like immigrants are welcome here, or some that have a lot more teeth, saying no resources for this city can be used for immigration enforcement. Or local police, so often what happens when somebody is detained by local police or state police, their fingerprints are automatically sent to the FBI, and the FBI then sends them on to the Department of Homeland Security, and then ICE will sometimes ask the local police, local or state police, to then hold the person until they can come pick them up. But police can have, states or counties can have policies saying, no, we won't hold those people. We will only hold people for, as long as there's some criminal reason or so as long as we have some reason to hold them, we won't hold them for ICE. And so a lot of cities, that's what mostly are people referring to when they talk about sanctuary city policies, is policies saying we will not hold when ICE asks us to. We won't help that way funnel people into ICE custody. And so one thing that you can do at the state, county, and city level is look into those policies. See if your state, county, or city has policies like that. And if not, then get involved. Start pushing for those policies. So the first important step before you start pushing for any policies is figure out who in your community is already working on this. Because in almost every place across the country, there's some group that already is, and it's really important to look for and plug into groups that are led by or accountable to the people who will actually be impacted by these policies. So people who are immigrants, people who are undocumented, people who have family members who are undocumented, et cetera. And it's really easy to Google this and just find out who's working in your area with immigrants and with undocumented folks. And so check in with them. See, are they pushing for policies? Have they pushed for policies in the past? What happened? Is there some way you can help? Being really aware that sometimes the way that you can help is some very small way. You can help with childcare. You can help folding pamphlets or something that you never know. You can bring food to a meeting, but really just follow the lead of those groups. But there's actually a lot of other really exciting things that local groups are doing that you can see what's going on in your area and try to get involved in. There are rapid response networks that are being built across the country. United We Dream is setting some of these up. There's others that are set up by local groups. The PICO Network are setting some of these up where you can sign up, and if there's a raid that happens that's reported in your area, you get a text message. You get some sort of an alert to go try to film, to follow up, to help out whoever that raid is targeting. There's also a network of, if you're a part of a faith congregation, of whatever faith, there's about 800 congregations across the country who are part of a sanctuary network. And you can go to sanctuary.deportation.org to get more information about this. But your faith congregation can offer to be a place of sanctuary for somebody who's undocumented and might need a place to stay for whatever reason. There's also one of the things we're doing here in D.C. and we've seen across the country be really important is there's a lot of people that have orders of removal that have been told that they're going to need to leave the country, but they have a stay of that removal. So they've been told, for now you can stay here. You have temporarily you can stay here, but they have to go check in with ICE periodically. And we're seeing a lot of people who have been told under the Obama administration that they could stay now being picked up when they go check in. And so we're setting up a system to actually accompany people to those check-ins so that it reduces the chance that they'll be picked up. And if they are then taken into custody, there's somebody to then communicate with their family to do whatever follow-up is needed. And in some cases where we think the risk of somebody getting detained is really high, we've actually done vigils, press conferences, things like that. We've actually seen to be pretty effective here in D.C., though that sort of it's different around the country and with different cases. Also, once people are detained, there's all sorts of campaigns around individual people to try to keep them from getting deported. And you might have seen some of these bigger campaigns around some of the people with deferred action for childhood arrival, so some of the dreamers who were picked up recently and threatened with deportation. But really, there's campaigns around all sorts of people who are risking deportation. So that's at the somewhat local level. At the sort of hyper-local level, a lot of what you've heard about NAFTA and about how U.S. policies have impacted folks in Mexico is the same for how U.S. trade policies have affected people in Central America and many other countries, and are a major push factor for immigration. And I think that it can be really effective to explain that to people as people are complaining about, people coming here to take our jobs or people flooding the United States and things like that, to really humanize it. And, as you hear people talking, like, really concerned about their jobs here in the United States, humanize it and say, and talk in a really personal way, if you can, honestly, and from a really first-person way, like, oh, I've heard people coming from Central America, coming from Mexico with very similar stories of losing their jobs, about being scared about their livelihood, about being able to support their families. And so instead of focusing on sort of statistics, which might make us feel really good to be able to talking about stories and humanizing it, and really talking from about individuals and about sort of from a personal place. So one last thing, as many of you will probably know, tomorrow is International Workers' Day. It's also going to be a really exciting day across the country for immigrant rights. There's going to be marches. A lot of people are going on strike across the country to push for fair and humane immigration policies, and to help make sure people realize what our economy would be like, what our country would be like if we didn't have immigrants taking up so much of the burden of the work that we do and that we rely on. And so there's lots of different people that are planning events across the country. Cosecha is one big one. You could go to their website, and there's actions across the country. If you go to Rise Up and Resist, you can find actions across the country. Really, just kind of Googling it. There's going to be we're hoping for at least 50,000 here in D.C. I know there's going to be huge marches in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York, but I think a lot of smaller towns and cities are also going to see events. But they're also if you know of strikes going on in your city, try to get in touch with the organizers and see if they're planning walkbacks for people who are striking, which is when people accompany workers back to their first shift, back on the job, to again try to risk the chance of retaliation and risk the chance that they'll be punished for having stood up for their rights and for their communities. So I've given you lots of different things to do. I know it's a lot of information really quickly, but I will leave it at that since we're at 9 o'clock and see if there's any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Kathryn. That was very informative. And if you have a question for Kathryn, if you haven't already put it in the chat box, please do it now.
Yeah, so hi, everyone. So our first question, this is more of a practical question, comes from Paul, who asks, Kathryn, if you could provide bullet points, because it's a very informative presentation, and would like some bullet points to break it down.
I can certainly try.
And Kathryn can be reached at kjohnson@afsc.org.
Kathryn, can you speak a bit to, as trade activists in particular, what are ways that we can use this understanding that we have of sort of the whole story about trade, or about the relationship between trade and migration in an advocacy way to challenge the scapegoating of immigrants and link the policy work that we're doing around trade activism to, and particularly around NAFTA, to the struggle for immigrant rights, in challenging in simultaneously challenging the administration's narrative on NAFTA while challenging the administration's immigration policies.
I think in both of the policies, it's a real demonization of Mexico, which creates an interesting dynamic and conundrum for those of us who are actually really frustrated with NAFTA, right? And who would like to see some renegotiation of NAFTA. But, as has been pointed out, understand that it was not a good deal for Mexico either, that it just generally hasn't been a good deal for workers or for agriculturalists or for generally people without resources in either country, that it's just caused massive dislocation and inequality. And I think being able to talk about that on both sides of the border and to humanize workers and humanize those who have been displaced on both sides of the border. This is a common struggle. And that I think you can use it as a way to keep people from being able to pit us against each other. It's not that we need to renegotiate NAFTA because Mexico won. It's because we need to renegotiate NAFTA because it's been a poor deal for everyone but corporations, essentially. And like I said, I think being able to talk about some of the push factors of immigration as these terrible trade policies that we've negotiated and we've, that our politicians really pushed on, certainly pushed on Mexican farmers, for example, but to not get too caught up in the intellectual piece of it. That really how you sway people, whether it's politicians or your, family at dinner, is through stories and through speaking from a first person. And remembering that and not getting too caught up in sort of trade deficits and things like that, but instead just talk about workers are hurting here, workers are hurting there. Let's focus on that and be compassionate and have compassionate policies.
Thank you.
I had a comment. This is Harriet. Just recently I read in my local paper that a Florida legislature, Florida is a state that voted for Trump, unfortunately. Florida legislature is passing a bill that would legally penalize officials in these sanctuary cities, and Miami would have been one of the sanctuary cities who go against Trump's immigration policies. I was wondering if you have any insight that you can give people on this call around that topic.
Actually, I'm not sure at the state level. There's been various different states who have pushed for anti-sanctuary city policies, and so that's a really important thing to watch out for at your state level, to watch for anti-sanctuary city bills, because there are in Texas, there are in various other states. Certainly at the federal level, what courts have very recently said is that it's illegal, actually, for the federal government to punish cities to pull funding, for example, for their sanctuary policies. And interestingly, that ended up hinging on a court case that overturned part of Obamacare. That was about the federal government not being able to force states to do certain things and hold a loaded gun to their head. It's a term they used by the courts. But in Miami, what I know the mayor has stepped back some of its policies, unfortunately, and that sounds like that's going to be quite a struggle. But the schools there have instead passed some really great policies to support students and parents who might be undocumented. And so if your city government is intractable and you don't really see yourself being able to make strides there, you might look at other parts of the government. There's things that colleges can do, things that school districts can do, other parts of the government.
Okay, thanks very much, Kathryn. It was great hearing from you again, and we certainly look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So with events like tomorrow, with Earth Day fairs, with the many opportunities in our communities to spread the word about NAFTA, it's great to have literature that we can distribute. Trade Justice Alliance is starting to build up a collection of publications. We have 2 flyers that were developed by our friend Pete Dolak at Trade Justice New York Metro, who has been a speaker on these calls before, that are accessible at the Trade Justice website at tradejustice.net/NAFTALit. That's NAFTA in all caps and LIT lowercase. I'll try and see if I can get some other combinations of the caps and lowercase there to make it simpler. But for right now, it's NAFTA, all capital, and lit, all lowercase. And we have 2 pieces that are there right now. One is a half-page flyer about NAFTA's impact on the environment, and another is a more general full-page NAFTA piece. Both are PDFs that you can print and distribute, 2-sided pieces, and great for handing out at events like perhaps rallies tomorrow and all kinds of other opportunities where you have the opportunity to talk to organizers and find out if they would be open to you sharing this message and making the connection to NAFTA's destructive impacts across so many issues. So again, that's tradejustice.net/NAFTA-lit.
Thanks, Adam. And now I'm going to open the floor to Carrie so she can talk about these great YouTube videos that she creates after the calls.
Thank you, Harriet. Hello, everybody. Yes, as many of you know that have been here before, we do put a YouTube video together after the call. We combine the slides and the audio from the call so that it all just flows along. And if you missed any part or had to come in late or leave early, you can catch up with what you missed on these videos. You can find all the videos are put up about a day or three after the call ends, and you can find them at tradejustice.net/webinar-vids. If you are looking at the webinar room right now, you can see some of the thumbnails from our previous topics, the trading down risks to your wallet. We've done TPP and water access rights. You can see last year's May Day thumbnail is down there too. And so if you check those out, and please share, like, comment on them. That helps boost the visibility so that YouTube itself suggests them when people search things like trade issues or NAFTA or something. These videos will come up. And that's something that you can do that helps a lot, helps get the word out, helps us promote the webinar, and helps these great speakers that we've had tonight and in the past live on in posterity. So that's my pitch for the YouTube video situation. Again, if you missed it, you can find a playlist on YouTube at tradejustice.net/webinar-vids.
Thanks, Carrie. Yes, and Carrie does such a great job in putting those together. We're very grateful to her. So, Adam, did you want to talk about the next call?
Yeah, and one of the by the way, just another one of the things that Carrie does produce these beautiful title cards for our webinars. I just wanted to give credit there, like this one you're looking at right now. On our next webinar, TISA's Threat to Democracy. This is about the Trade and Services Agreement. We're still in the process of booking speakers for that call, but confirmed so far is Sanya Reed-Smith from the Third World Network, and there will be another speaker to be announced. That webinar is going to be Sunday, May 21st, same time as always, 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific, and we will be there's already a Facebook event for that webinar. If you go to the tradejustice.net website and click on our upcoming events link, you can find a link to the Facebook page for that webinar, or just go directly to our Trade Justice Alliance Facebook group and click the events tab there, and you can register, or you can RSVP for that webinar on Facebook. If you haven't already registered for our webinars generally, you can follow the registration links for our registration form. And please invite your Facebook friends to the webinar. Share the Facebook event to your timeline. Help us get the word out, and share your email, social media, all kinds of social media, etc. Let's keep promoting these webinars. And on that note, that's helping with our social media promotion is one way you can support this effort, but there are many things that you can do. Trade Justice Alliance is a volunteer-run project, and we need lots more people to help make this effort even more effective. We particularly need help with publicity. We also just need help organizing these webinars, and we need all of you to help. So these webinars are held usually the last Sunday of every month. Next month we're doing it a week early because of Memorial Day weekend. But every Tuesday we hold planning calls for these webinars and the other aspects of Trade Justice Alliance. And those are held at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, and you are all invited to join. You join by using the same number that you used to join this call, 712-770-2030. 4160. That's 712-770-4160. And the PIN number is 802787#. And like I said, we really need all manner of help, whether you'd like to focus on promoting our webinar videos to the staff of elected officials, whether you'd like to help promote on social media, whether you'd like to help with outreach to relevant organizations who might be interested in learning more about our webinars, whether you want to help with speaker recruitment or putting together the PowerPoint presentations. There's lots of need for help, and we welcome everyone to join us. Another way that you can help, if you don't have time to volunteer, we also, or if you do and also want to help in this way, we do accept donations to cover the cost of things like our Action Network site, which is our Action Network account, which is one of the ways that we promote these webinars, and other online tools and technical needs that are part of these webinars. So you can donate to Trade Justice Alliance by going to tradejustice.net/TJA donate, all lowercase. That's tradejustice.net/TJA donate. So thanks, everyone, and please join us next month, and also please join us on Tuesday if you're able, and help build the alliance and help us fight for a more just global trade policy.
Thanks, Adam. And thank you all for joining us. And now we're going to open the lines up, and you want to hang out with us for a while? You're welcome to do that.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Harriet. Hi, Adam.
Laura and Celeste are not in the chat box, so I'm assuming they're no longer on the call. But if either of you are, thank you for your excellent presentation. Really great job, everyone.
Kathryn is still
really
on.
Kathryn's still on. Thank you, Kathryn.
You're welcome.
That was a great call.